The daycare teacher said my husband picked our daughter up early twice a week. I just found out what he was doing with her. I stared at her in total confusion because he never got home with our daughter before 5:30. Are you sure? I asked. The teacher pulled out her attendance log and showed me 8 weeks of pickups I knew nothing about. I left the daycare and sat in my car Googling Chris's office number, calling his department directly. His coworker laughed when I asked for Chris, saying he'd only worked mornings on Tuesdays and Thursdays for months. I called in sick to work and drove home.
Não acordei muito bem não, já ia reclamar, mas eu lembrei, olha o que Deus fez pra nós. Eu lembrei que a gente no hospital agora que tá com poucos dias de vida. Lembrei que essa manhã tem gente que nem acordou.
Sophie had been singing this song lately about Mama Jess and baby brother that I thought was from cartoons. I recognized the street name from Chris's company directory as where Jessica lived, the new marketing manager. When Chris got home, I had everything spread across the kitchen table and told him I knew about the pickups. He didn't even try to deny it, just sat down and admitted he'd been taking Sophie to Jessica's apartment twice a week for 2 months. While I thought our daughter was at daycare, she'd been at another woman's home playing house. Jessica had set up a pink bedroom just for Sophie, bought her clothes and toys, been teaching our 3-year-old to call her Mama Jess. But it was worse than an affair because Jessica was 4 months pregnant with Chris's baby. The timing made me sick because 4 months ago I was in the middle of IVF treatments that we'd spent $20,000 on. He'd watched me inject myself hormones every morning, held my hand through the egg retrievals, comforted me through 3 failed cycles, all while his girlfriend was already pregnant. They'd been using Sophie as practice for their new family, and our daughter had been helping them decorate a nursery, picking out dinosaur wallpaper for her baby brother's room. Chris showed me photos on his phone of Sophie at Jessica's apartment, eating lunch Jessica made, napping in the pink bed, playing with toys I'd never seen. 32 days over 2 months where my daughter was bonding with my replacement while I worked to support us. They'd enrolled Sophie in a Montessori school near Jessica's apartment without telling me, had toured it together like a real family. Jessica's lease was up next month, and they'd already put an offer on a house with for Sophie, a nursery for the baby, and a master bedroom for them. Sophie asked if she could live with Chris said she wants to be with the baby. The cruelty of turning my daughter against me by giving her a sibling through another woman was breathtaking. While I'd been crying over negative pregnancy tests, Jessica was taking Sophie to her prenatal appointments, letting her hear the baby's heartbeat, making her an accomplice in this betrayal. Chris pulled out a folder with emails to a divorce lawyer from 3 weeks ago, where he'd been asking about custody and establishing Jessica as an existing caregiver. The Tuesday-Thursday pattern wasn't random, but strategic documentation for court. Every pickup had been logged, every receipt saved, every photo time-stamped to show Jessica as a consistent maternal
Primeiro passo,
presence
você vai
in
chapar uma
Sophie's
porção
life.
de massa
She's a
na
better
altura em
mother
média
than
de
you,
1,60
Chris said
m.
flatly.
Em seguida,
Sophie
vai
doesn't
fixar
have
uma
tantrums
talice
with
que
her,
pode ser
actually
feita com
eats
pedaços de
vegetables,
pia.
goes to bed
Retirar o
without
excesso das
crying.
massas
Every
das
normal
laterais.
parenting
E ajustar até
struggle I've
atingir a
ever had
espessura
was being
ideal para a
weaponized
cobertura do
against me.
reboco.
My own
O
mother
ideal é
had
utilizar
known
o
for
nível
a
de
month
mão para
because
fazer a
Chris had needed
conferência do...
someone to help with pickups when we had real meetings. She'd been dropping Sophie until the crisis had met a woman replacement, had seen the nursery being built for the grandchild that wasn't ours. Your mom agrees this is best, Chris said. Sophie needs stability. 2 parents, a sibling, not whatever this is. He gestured around our small rental house like it was proof of my failure. The papers I'd signed last month thinking they were for his insurance had actually been removing me from our car loans, our joint accounts, everything except the credit card debt. They'd planned this takeover of my life so carefully that Sophie now cried when she had to leave Jessica's house, asked when she could go back to the pink room, wanted Mama Jess to read her bedtime stories instead of me. I told him he couldn't just steal our daughter, but we both knew he'd already been doing exactly that for months. Chris grabbed his keys and headed for the door, announcing he was staying at Jessica's tonight. Sophie's coming with me, he said casually. I just told your mom the jig's up, so she said she'll pick her up and bring her by Jessica's. My own mother was helping him, was in on this betrayal, delivering my daughter to another woman's arms. She agrees that Jessica's more stable, Chris said at the door. Sophie needs a real family with 2 parents and a sibling, not a broke single mother. Jessica's moving in next week. You should start looking for an apartment. I stood there frozen as he walked out with his overnight bag, and through the window, I watched him throw Sophie's favorite stuffed dinosaur into his car, the purple one she couldn't sleep without. My hands shook so bad I could barely hold my phone as it hit me that he was really taking her tonight, and my own mother was driving over right now to help him do it. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts looking for that lawyer my coworker Sarah mentioned last month when her sister went through her divorce. Serena Ashworth picked up even though it was after 8, and when I explained what was happening right now, she told me to document everything with photos and notes. She said to record anything I could legally record and write down every single thing Chris had admitted tonight while it was still fresh. I started taking pictures of everything Chris had left spread across the kitchen table, all his evidence of taking Sophie to Jessica's, the receipts and logs and emails to his divorce lawyer. My hands were still shaking, but I forced myself to photograph every page, every receipt, making sure the dates and times were clear. Then I heard my mother's car in the driveway, and she walked in without knocking like she unnoticed, avoiding eye contact as she headed straight for Sophie's room. I followed her with my phone recording, watching her pack Sophie's overnight bag with clothes and toys like this was totally normal. When I asked her how she could do this to me, she just kept packing and said Jessica was more stable, and it was what's best for Sophie. She said I was too stressed from work and the failed IVF to be a good mother right now, that Sophie needed consistency and 2 parents who weren't fighting all the time. Sophie came out of her room confused and scared, rubbing her eyes and asking why Grandma was packing her things in the middle of bedtime. My mother told her she was having a special sleepover at Daddy and Mama Jess's new house, and I had to bite my tongue hard to keep from screaming the truth about what was really happening. Sophie started crying that she wanted to stay with me, reaching for me, but my mother picked her up and carried her toward the door saying Daddy was waiting. I followed them outside trying to comfort Sophie without making things worse, telling her I loved her and would see her soon, even though I had no idea when Chris would let me see her again. After they drove away with Sophie crying for me in the back seat, pressing her little face against the window, I went back inside and photographed everything Chris had left on the table again from different angles. I opened my laptop and created a new document, typing out every single detail I could remember about the past 2 months while the betrayal was still burning fresh in my mind. I wrote about the Tuesday-Thursday pattern, the daycare pickups I never knew about, Chris only working mornings, my mother helping him, Jessica's pregnancy timing with our IVF treatment. I documented Sophie's songs about Mama Jess and baby brother, the pink bedroom, the Montessori school enrollment, the house they put an offer on, everything Chris had thrown in my face tonight. I stayed up all night organizing everything into folders on my computer, scanning the receipts, organizing the daycare logs, saving the screenshots I'd managed to grab from Chris's phone before he left. I made folders for each week, cross-referencing dates with my work calendar to show I'd been at the office while Chris was taking Sophie to Jessica's apartment. By morning, I had a comprehensive file showing exactly how they planned this whole thing, how systematic and deliberate their plan to steal my daughter had been. At 7 sharp, I was standing outside the bank when they unlocked the doors and I went straight to a teller to move my direct deposit to a new account only I could access. The teller looked concerned when I explained I needed to protect my paycheck from my husband, but she helped me set up a new account and transfer everything except the minimum to keep the joint account open.
Get our
She
little
showed me
paint
how to remove
right on the
Chris's
edge of the knife
access to
again.
any new accounts
And
and
let's
help
just
me
let it
update my
bounce
work's
along
direct
here and
deposit
play.
information right
Just
there at her
touch it.
desk. Then I sat in my car and
Gotta
called the
make that little
daycare,
noise,
asking
though.
to speak with the director about adding
All
security
there is
to
to it.
Sophie's
Just let it
file. I
bounce.
added a password that had to be given
Let the
before any
knife
changes
touch.
could be made, specifically
The
removing
canvas will
Chris's
pull off what
ability
it
to
wants.
change
Give
anything
you
without
back
my
what's
consent.
left.
The director told me Chris had actually tried to withdraw
There we are.
Sophie completely last month, but couldn't because he needed both parents' signatures for that. She said she'd been wondering why Chris had been asking about their withdrawal policy, and now it made sense, and she promised to document everything for me. At 9, I was sitting in Serena's office going through everything while she took notes and asked questions about specific dates and times. I wonder what Chris was thinking during those months of search. Did he really believe Sophie would just forget about their actual mother? The way he documented everything so carefully while watching his wife go through IVF treatment makes me curious about when exactly he decided what to do. We spent 3 hours going through every single piece of evidence, with Serena explaining that Chris's own documentation actually helped us because it showed deliberate deception. She said judges really don't like it when one parent makes major decisions about a child's care without telling the other parent, especially when it involves another adult the child is calling mama. She explained that establishing Jessica as a caregiver without my knowledge or consent was actually a form of parental alienation, and the fact that they'd enrolled Sophie in a different school showed they were planning to cut me out completely. We worked together drafting an emergency motion for temporary custody orders, emphasizing how Chris had unilaterally made huge decisions about Sophie's care without my knowledge
Ain't no
or consent for 2
sunshine
whole
when
months.
she's gone.
Serena said we needed to
She's
file
always
immediately before
gone
Chris
too
could establish
long.
Jessica's house as Sophie's
She
primary
goes
residence,
away.
because once that happened, it was much harder to get her back. Right then, my phone buzzed with an email from Mike Barkley at Chris's office, and I opened it while Serena was still organizing papers. Mike had
गुटखा
responded to
खाने
my
वालों में
earlier
उच्च
message with the
संस्कार
exact
होते हैं। वे
confirmation
बड़े
I
शांत
needed,
और मौन रहते
forwarding me
हैं।
the official
थूक कर
schedule
केवल
change form
देखो,
Chris
जब कोई तुमसे
had
बात करना
completed 4
चाहता है
months ago, busting to work
तो स्लो
only
रिप्लाईज में ही
Tuesday and
सही
Thursday mornings.
जवाब
The
दे
form
दिया
showed
करो,
Chris's signature
और नहीं
and
मन
his
करता
manager's
तुम्हारा
approval
बात करने
stamp
का
dating
उससे
back when I was starting my
तो
second
सीधे
round of
बोल दो ना
IVF
उसे।
shots. Serena grabbed
ऐसे
the phone
इग्नोर
from
मत
my
किया
hand
कर।
and immediately
तुम सीन पे
printed
छोड़ के
three
चले
copies
जाते हो
of
उसके
emails
मैसेज को।
highlighting the dates and adding to our evidence folder. She told me to call my mother right now while we had momentum and handed me her office phone, explaining that our state allowed single-party consent for recording conversations. My hands shook as I dialed my mother's number, and Serena pressed the record button on her computer when my mother picked up. I kept my voice steady and asked her directly how long she'd been helping Chris take Sophie to Jessica's apartment. My mother sighed and admitted she'd been doing it for a month because she thought I was too stressed from work and the IVF treatment to be a good mother right now. She actually said Jessica seemed more stable and that Sophie was happier there with the pink bedroom and all the new toys. I asked her if she thought it was okay to lie to me about where my daughter was, and she said sometimes people need help even when they don't know it. Serena was
Primeiro você
taking
vai
notes
pedir
as my
pra
mother
Deus
kept talking, explaining how
ideias.
Jessica had
Deus vai te dar
everything
boas
organized, and
ideias.
Sophie never cried there like she did at home with me. When I hung up, Serena saved the recording and made backup copies on 2 different drives, saying this was exactly the kind of evidence we needed to show bias and deception. That night, I couldn't sleep at all, so I opened my laptop and started creating a detailed spreadsheet of every single time I could remember Chris lying about where he was. I went through my calendar, my texts, my bank statements, matching dates and times with what Chris had told me versus what I now knew was true. The pattern went back way further than 2 months because I found restaurant charges from 6 months ago when Jessica first started at his company. There were afternoon coffee purchases near her apartment when he was supposedly in meetings, weekend hardware store trips when we didn't do any home projects, movie tickets for 2 when he said he was working late. By 4 in the morning, I had 63 instances documented with dates, times, and evidence. And the pattern was so clear. Monday morning, Serena met me at the courthouse at 8 sharp, and we filed the emergency motion with the clerk who stamped it and gave us the date number. The clerk said to get a clear date from the minute he handed us the
You want
paperwork
to hear a
showing
hot
Chris would
take
be
of
served
mine?
within 24 hours.
I don't think
Serena
Mike
warned me
Myers
that
was
once
the right
Chris got
voice for
served,
sure.
he would probably
It
retaliate and try to
really
make
bothers
things
me
worse.
to the
So I
point
needed
where
to
I
stay
can
calm
barely
no
even
matter
watch
what
the
he
movie
did or
because I
said.
just
She
feel
gave
like
me her
he's
cell
not
number and told
tracked.
me to
What
document
about
everything,
Donkey?
but not
Donkey's
engage with him
great.
directly.
Honestly,
Just
most of the
forward
other
everything
characters.
to her. That afternoon, Brianna Ashby from the daycare called to say she'd completed the sworn statement Serena had requested about the pickup patterns. She was faxing over copies of the attendance logs showing exactly when Chris picked up Sophie versus when he'd told me she was at daycare, and she'd highlighted all the discrepancies in yellow marker. Brianna also included notes about Chris's attempts to change Sophie's enrollment without my permission and how he'd asked about withdrawal policies multiple times. She said she'd been keeping detailed notes because something had seemed off about the whole situation, and now she understood why. Friday came, and it was my first scheduled visitation with Sophie since Chris had taken her to Jessica's house. When I picked her up at the daycare, she immediately asked where Mama Jess was and when she could go back to see the baby's room. She kept talking about the dinosaur wallpaper and the new toys and asking if we could go there instead of going home. I stayed calm and redirected her to the playground, pushing her on the swings while my heart broke into pieces listening to her talk
People that talk about these things being kind of
Sophie
gimmick
asked
or
3
it's
more times
fast or
during our
shovel.
afternoon together when she could see the baby, and I
Got
just
6
kept saying
inches of
baby
heavy
later
wet
and
snow.
changing the subject. Monday, I had my first therapy session with Dennis Barnard, and I completely fell apart in his office talking about the IVF failures. I told him
Yo
about the
sinceramente yo no me
$20,000
trabajo
we'd
por pura
spent, the daily
distracción,
hormone injections, the 3 failed cycles, all while Chris was already getting Jessica pregnant. Dennis handed me tissues as I sobbed about the cruelty of it, how Chris had held my hand during the diaper treatment and comforted me after each level of deception wasn't my fault, and that my rage was completely justified. He gave me breathing exercises to use when the anger felt overwhelming, and scheduled me for twice weekly sessions to help me process everything. Meanwhile, Serena was filing additional documentation with the court about Chris hiding assets and making financial decisions without my knowledge. She submitted copies of the insurance papers I'd signed, thinking they were routine updates, but were actually removing me from our car loans and joint accounts. She showed the pattern of deception went beyond just the affair and custody issues to include financial manipulation, designed to leave me with nothing but debt. At work, I finally had to tell my boss why I needed time off for court hearings because I couldn't keep calling in sick. She called me into her office and I explained the basics of what was happening with Chris and Sophie. To my surprise, she was incredibly supportive, immediately offering to let me work from home when needed and adjust my schedule around court dates. She told me she'd gone through something similar 5 years ago and knew how impossible it was to focus on spreadsheets when your whole life was falling apart. She even gave me the name of her lawyer in case I needed a second opinion and told me to take whatever time I needed. By Thursday, Chris started his retaliation campaign by sending emails with photos of Sophie at Jessica's house, showing her playing in the pink bedroom and eating dinner at Jessica's table. Each email had captions about how happy Sophie looked and how she'd asked to stay there instead of coming home with me. Serena reviewed each one and helped me write neutral responses that just said received without engaging in his obvious attempts to make me angry. She explained that judges could see through this kind of manipulation, and it would actually help our case to show his pattern of provocation. I forwarded everything to Serena, and she added it to our growing file of evidence, showing Chris's attempts to alienate Sophie from me and provoke me into an emotional response that he could use against me in court. Serena called Monday morning saying the mediation was set for next week, and we needed to get hard because Chris would try to paint me as unstable. She had me come to her office that afternoon, where we spent 3 hours going over every possible question they might ask. She told me Jessica would definitely be there to intimidate me, probably wearing something that showed off her pregnant belly to remind everyone she was giving Sophie a sibling. I had to practice staying calm when they called Sophie our daughter, and not correcting them when Jessica acted like Sophie's mother. Serena made me repeat facts without emotion over and over until I could say them without my voice shaking. Meanwhile, I spent every evening that week looking at apartments because Chris kept texting that I needed to be out by the end of the month. The first place I toured was in a rough neighborhood with broken glass in the parking lot and police
Meu patrão,
sirens
deixa eu
going
perguntar
off while the landlord
senhor.
showed me around.
É
The
só o
second
senhor que é o dono
apartment
da
had mold in
empresa,
the
ou
bathroom
não?
and bars on the windows, but it was all I could afford on my salary alone. The third place was 40 minutes from Sophie's daycare, which would mean waking her up at 5 in the morning just to get her there on time. The fourth apartment was above a bar, and the music was so loud during the tour I couldn't hear the property manager talking. By Friday, I finally found a small studio that was clean and safe and still in Sophie's school district. It was tiny, just one room with a kitchenette and a bathroom, but the landlord said kids were allowed and it was month to month so I could move if I found something better. I signed the lease that day, even though it meant Sophie would have to sleep on a pull-out couch when she stayed with me. Something about Serena's confidence makes me wonder. She's acting like this is all wrapped up already and the custody battles are messy. The way she keeps saying Chris is helping their case feels too neat. Wednesday's mediation was exactly what Serena warned me about. Jessica sat right next to Chris with her hand on her belly the whole time, wearing a tight dress that made her pregnancy super obvious. They came in holding hands and Chris pulled out her chair like they were some perfect
Traz
couple.
pra
When the
cá,
mediator asked
Lúcia,
about
traz pra
custody
cá que a
arrangements,
ferramenta
Jessica
tá
actually spoke
aqui.
up, saying she'd been Sophie's
Ó,
primary
escuta aí eu
caregiver for
batendo ela
months.
na
She called
parede, ó.
herself Sophie's real mother and said I was just the biological parent who couldn't provide stability. I wrote down every word on the legal pad Serena gave me instead of screaming that she'd stolen my daughter. Chris showed photos of Sophie's pink bedroom at Jessica's apartment and talked about the nursery they were building for the baby. He said Sophie was excited about being a big sister and had helped pick out the crib. The mediator asked about my living situation, and I had to admit I was moving to a studio apartment while Chris described their new 4-bedroom house with a backyard and swing set. When they suggested I should only have supervised visits, Serena finally spoke up with our documentation showing Chris's deception and financial manipulation. The emergency hearing happened 2 days later, way faster than we expected. The judge was an older woman who looked annoyed from the start, especially when Chris's lawyer tried to argue that I was being vindictive. She reviewed the emergency motion while we sat there in silence. Then she looked directly at Chris and asked why he'd been making major decisions about Sophie without informing me. His lawyer tried to spin it as him being the more involved parent, but the judge cut him off. She ordered that Chris couldn't change Sophie's school or daycare without my written consent and set up a temporary schedule giving me Sophie Thursday through Sunday. She also ordered that all exchanges had to happen at the daycare with no direct contact between Chris and me. Jessica actually gasped when the judge said she wasn't allowed at the exchanges. Best of all, the judge appointed someone called a guardian ad litem to figure out what was actually best for Sophie instead of just listening to Chris's lies. Her name was Gabrielle Appel, and she'd be interviewing everyone and making recommendations to the court. For the first time in weeks, I felt like someone might actually see the truth instead of just believing Chris's story about me being an unfit mother. Gabrielle called me the next Monday to set up our first interview. She came to my new studio apartment and I showed her everything. The timeline I'd created, all the receipts and documentation, the emails showing Chris's deception. She took notes about everything, especially the fact that Sophie had been taken to Jessica's apartment for 2 months without my knowledge. She asked about Sophie's behavior changes, and I told her about the accidents and nightmares and how Sophie kept asking for mom and dad. Gabrielle wrote it all down without judgment, just asking follow-up questions to understand the whole picture. She spent 2 hours with me and said she'd be observing Sophie during exchanges and interviewing Chris and Jessica next. When Gabrielle interviewed them, according to what she told me later, they gave her a full tour of the pink bedroom and nursery, but she asked pointed questions they weren't ready for, like why they hadn't included me in decisions about Sophie's education, and why they thought it was appropriate to have Sophie call Jessica mama. She told me Chris got defensive when she asked about the financial papers he tricked me into signing. 2 weeks later, my mother showed up at daycare during my pickup time, trying to take Sophie. The daycare director called me confused because my mother was insisting Chris had sent her. I drove there immediately and found